Greetings from Brother Stephen. I'm a disciple and witness of Jesus Christ to all the inhabitants of the earth. I present to you as a witness the gospel of the kingdom, or the gospel of the church of Jesus Christ. In this lesson, I have titled here the Bible. I'm going to be going over or answering the question for a lot of people: what is the Bible? And where does it come from? Anybody in this day and age who reads the Bible, they should at least understand the basic history of the Bible, where it comes from, before they blindly adopt a religion. You should know the foundation of that religion. And pretty much that is what the Bible is for most people, a foundation for religion. But in this lesson, we're going to comb through some information. Again, answering the question, what is the Bible? Where does it come from? Now, if this is your first time tuning in or watching one of my videos, I strongly urge you to watch part 1 and part 2 of what it means to be blessed in the Old Testament and the New Testament, because it will open your eyes up to reality, rather this man-made fantasy that everybody lives in today. So, starting off, again, what is the Bible and where does it come from? Of course, I'm in America, so I'm talking about the #1 book ever sold in America is the King James Version Bible of 1769. We have 39 books in the Old Testament, and we have 27 books in the New Testament. So this is the Bible that I am referring to in this lesson. Now, to answer the question, what is the Bible and where does it come from? I'm actually going to start in the Bible. I'm going to start off with the first 5 books, which is from Genesis to Deuteronomy. And the reason I'm starting off with these books is because most people believe that these books was wrote by a man named Moses. Now, what I have here is his Hebrew name, and the correct pronunciation is Moshe. It is not Moses. And most people think that these books was wrote by Moshe and that they were wrote from 1446 through 1406 BC. BC means before Christ. Before Christ, time counts down. After Christ, time counts up. So again, 1446 to 1406 BC, that's time counting down until the birth of Christ. Then once Christ is born, time start counting upwards from 0 to 1000, year 2019, and so on until his return. So again, most people think that these books was wrote by Moshe during this era, but they were not. Moshe did not write one book that is in the Bible we have today. A matter of fact, what I have here, these first books from Genesis to 2 Kings, they were all most likely wrote by the same person. We don't know when he started writing these books, but we know he stopped writing these books around 590 BC or 580 BC, 570 BC. The exact time we don't know, but again, as we get into this lesson, we're going to give information to prove everything that I'm saying. Now, the first thing I'm going to do just to prove that Moshe did not write the book of Genesis, or the first 5 books in our current Bible, is if you go to Exodus chapter 3, verse 3, it says, "And Moshe said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt." Now, the main thing I'm focusing on here is this term here, Moshe said. If Moshe was the one actually writing these books, he would not be saying Moshe said. It will be saying, "and I said." So it is not wrote from a first person point of view. It's wrote from a, I believe what they call a third person point of view. Now, I have here plus 29 because this term, Moshe said, occurs 29 plus times just in the book of Exodus alone. That's not including Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So again, that's one of the first proofs I used to show people that Moshe did not write these books. The second one is when you go to if Moshe was the one who wrote the book of Deuteronomy, when you get to Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 5, verse 5 and 6 says, So Moshe, the servant of Jehovah, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of Jehovah. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, over against Beth Peor, but no man knows of the sepulchre unto this day. So the first thing is just a common sense that if Moshe wrote the book of Deuteronomy, how can he be continuing to write the book of Deuteronomy after he is deceased? So there's a lot of other things that I can get into to prove that Moshe did not write the first 5 books in the Bible that we have today, but I believe those 2 is enough evidence to confirm it. And then just for the sake of the lesson, so this is not a really long lesson, get to some other points. So the next question I have is this unknown author who is writing Genesis to 2 Kings, where is he getting the information, or where's this information coming from when he's saying, and Moshe said, where he get all the information from Genesis about creation, when you get until you get down to 2 Kings about all the kings that ever ruled over either the northern or southern kingdoms in Israel. Where is he getting all of this information from? So to prove where he's getting this information from, I'm using his work. He actually tell you while he's writing where a lot of his information is coming from. So give you an example. When you go to Exodus 17 and 14, it says, And Jehovah said unto Moshe, Write this in a memorial, in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Yahashua. Most people think Yahashua is the Hebrew name for Christ, which it is not. Yahashua is the servant of Moses, who took Moses' place after he died and led the children of Israel into the promised land to conquer the Canaanites and the other inhabitants of the land. So Yahashua is not Christ's name. It is the servant of Moses, and Joshua is just a false translation. His real name is Yahashua. Joshua is a pseudonym, which is a name just kind of made up to hide somebody's true name and nationality. But we will continue to talk about that in another lesson. He says, For I will utterly put them out, the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Now, I have here book of Moshe, is because this is Jehovah telling Moshe to write it down in a book for a memorial. In other words, to bring it into remembrance, to teach other people. So Moshe is one of the first people to start writing a book about the experiences and the history of Israel and Jehovah. So here we just have the book of Moshe. And again, this is where this unknown author is getting his information from. In other words, he's not plagiarizing. He's letting you know where the information is coming from. Now, next, we're just going to go to the book of Yahashua. Most people say Joshua 10:13, but again, the correct name is Yahashua. And we'll just read. It says, And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is not this written in the book of Jasher? Now, most people again say Jasher. Those are false translations. There was no J sound or J letter in Hebrew. So we have here, and I have right here in bold, we have a book of Jasher. Now you get to Numbers 21 and 14. We have a book of wars of Jehovah mentioned, and a book of Edom mentioned. And again, these are the books that this unknown writer of Genesis to 2 Kings is getting his information from. He's quoting these as he's writing. When you get to 1 Kings, verse 14, 19 and verse 29 mentions the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. Now, this is not the same book of First and Second Chronicles, because they're getting this information from older books. They're actually what they are students who are studying the history of their people, and most likely translating it from one form of Hebrew to a new, and just shortening up the information. And then we're going to give a little bit more details of why they're doing this as we go through the study. Again, when you go to 1 Samuel 10 and 25, it says, then Samuel told the people the manner of the kingdom and wrote it in a book. So we also have the history. We know that Samuel wrote a book, and so this will be referring to kind of that book of Samuel. Now, the book of Samuel that he's mentioning here is not the same book of Samuel that is in the Bible we have today. This book of Samuel is the original. He's reading the original book of Samuel, and he's basically studying the history of the children of Israel. And again, 1 Kings 11, verse 41, it says, and the rest of the acts of Solomon and all that he did and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? So this was another book that he was reading to get his information from. So now, basically what I have here is those books that we just mentioned, from Moshe to the Acts of Solomon. These books was wrote from 1446 BC to 539 BC. And basically what we have in the Bible today is we have an unknown person going over all of this material and summing it up. These books and information would have been huge. A lot of them, especially if they coming from Moshe, would have been wrote on stone and clay, and most likely written in an earlier form of Hebrew, what most people refer to as ancient Hebrew. So here, this unknown author from Genesis to 2 Kings is going over, he's studying and going over all the history of the children of Israel, and he is summing it all up and most likely translating it into a Middle or modern Hebrew at that time. So again, we have the unknown author. We don't know the exact time that he started studying the history and going over the history of Israel and translating it to basically to preserve it. But we know about 590 BC, 580, 570 BC is when his writings end. And again, we're going to later on through the study give you some more information so you understand how I know that. Now, the next two books after 1 King and 2 Kings is 1 Chronicle and 2 Chronicles. Now, this is also evidence of how you know one person wrote from Genesis to 2 Kings, because 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles is all the same information from Genesis to 2 Kings. We don't know who the author is of Chronicles also. We don't know when he started writing the Chronicles, but we know they ended about the same time as 1 Kings and 2 Kings. Now, basically what I have here, the reason there's so many, the reason this unknown author book is so long is because he was just more thorough in his studying when he's studying about the history of Israel before the kings. Now, when you get to 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles, he's not really focused on the history of Israel before the kings. He's more detailed when it comes to the information about Israel once it is established as a kingdom. So, and now when you read 1 King and 2 Kings, he's not as detailed as Chronicles are when he's talking about the kings that ruled over Israel. Now, again, to confirm this, if you go to Genesis chapter 1, literally from chapter 1 to chapter 5, verse 61, Chronicles cover all of that information literally in one verse in 3 words. Instead of going in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and being detailed about Adam and Eve and Seth and Enos, he simply says Adam, Seth, Enos. He's just giving the genealogy, but Chronicles chapter 1 verse 1, it starts in the beginning, just like Genesis starts in the beginning. Now, Second Kings and Second Chronicles end also talking about the same thing. When you get to Second Chronicles chapter 25 and Second Kings chapter 25 and Second Chronicles chapter 36, both end with the fall of Jerusalem. So again, this is just more proof that the unknown author from Genesis to Second Kings, this is the same person writing. These are just students. Most people think that God just inspired their mind and fed all this information into their mind without them reading, without them studying, and that's just not reality. The reality of it is the Bible that we have today come from people who studied their butts off. They studied the history, they studied the material. They were studiers, they were scholars. Like we are all supposed to be today. We're supposed to be scholars. So now, just like I mentioned earlier, how the unknown author of Genesis to Second Kings used older books that we just don't have to gather the information to do his research. The author of First Chronicles and Second Chronicles does the exact same thing. Now, I didn't in First Chronicles and Second Chronicles, he mentioned some of these same books. I'm not going to mention those same books for time's sakes, but I'm going to go over a few of the other books that he mentions. So you just have it as a reference. When you go to First Chronicles 27 to 24, he mentioned a book called the Chronicles of the King of David. Now he says the account of the Chronicles of King of David, which means this could come from the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel and Yehuda. When you get to First Chronicles 29 and 29, he mentioned a book of Samuel the seer. And again, that same thing, First and Second Samuel. I said earlier, these are not the original books of Samuel. Most likely he was reading earlier writings from Samuel and was rehearsing them, studying them, preserving them. We have the book of Nathan the prophet that the author of Chronicles is getting information from, and the book of Gad the seer. When you get to Second Chronicles chapter 9 verses 29, he mentions the book of Nathan. In other words, he's not plagiarizing. He's letting you know where he's getting his information from. He also mentioned the prophecy of Ahaziah, the visions of Iddo the seer. We have the book of Kings of Yehuda and Israel. And again, that might be just the long name for where the Chronicles of the King of David come from. It probably was kept in the same book. Then we have the written book of Yahud. And we have the visions of Isaiah the prophet. So this is where they're getting their information from, again, to from Genesis to Second Chronicles. Now, again, I just have another image here. These books would have been wrote from 1446 to 539 BC. These are older books that we just don't have access to. Some people try to call these the lost books, but these are not lost books. These books just have been destroyed. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later in this lesson. And if it wasn't for these unknown authors, if they did not preserve the history of Israel, it would have been lost. So again, this question mark here, have a question that says, what are these books? And of course, these books are just the history of Israel. They're the older books that we just don't have access to. They are not lost books. They are destroyed books. They do not exist anymore. And again, if it wasn't for these authors, the history of Israel would have been lost. This is, again, just how God makes sure that the children of Israel always know their history. His word is preserved. So again, what are these books? If you go back to Exodus chapter 17, verse 14, when it says, "And Jehovah said unto Moshe, write these for a memorial." These books are being written for a memorial for the people of Israel, so they do not forget their history. Now I have here, what are they about? And again, I'm just referring to these books. What are these books about? The reason we know what these lost books is about is because these unknown authors of, again, Genesis to 2 Kings and the Book of Chronicles, they let you know the information that is in those books. They don't give us all the information. They just pretty much sum it up, taking out the important information, so the children of Israel history is not lost. Now, I have two more questions here. Third question is, what happened to these books? And I'll just say it now. These books, I'm referring to these books right here. What happened to them, and where does the rest of the Bible come from? Because so far we only covered Genesis to 2 Chronicles. So the rest of this lesson is pretty much going to answer these next two questions. What happened to these books, and where does the rest of the Bible come from? Because we have the rest of the Old Testament, then we have to cover the entire New Testament. So basically, to answer these next two questions, I'm going to start off, and this is a chart, starting with the King of Saul. Now, most people know the story of Adam and Eve, or Adam and Chava. They know the story of Noach, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. They know the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. They know the story of the children of Israel being slaves in Egypt. They know the story of Moses delivering them. They know the story about Moses parting the Red Sea. But this is a part of the Bible that most people don't know. This is very important. This is one of the stories that really should be taught. And it's basically starting off with the story of Saul, David, and Solomon. It is when once Yahushua led the children of Israel to conquer the land of Canaan, the promised land. Basically the story of how they became a nation and a kingdom, and how that nation and kingdom crumbled. So again, we're just going to kind of be starting off with Saul. And again, this is just a diagram that I created. This BC, for instance, this line up here will represent 1040 BC. This is before Christ. And we're going all the way down to 420 BC. And this is just basically an outline, so you can kind of understand what the Old Testament is and what the Bible was about. Just being real brief, the kingdom of Israel at one time was united as one kingdom, and this picture here represents that one kingdom. And then, when it was one kingdom, Saul, David, and Solomon ruled that kingdom. After Solomon died, the kingdom was split into two kingdoms. You have the kingdom of Israel, which is the northern tribes, and this map represents that. The kingdom of Israel, this blue area, and that's why I have these words here in blue. And then you have the kings of Israel, the southern tribe, and that's the kingdom of Yehuda, the gold area, and that's why this one is gold. Now, earlier I mentioned that it would be a good idea to watch those first two studies that I went over. Blessed in the Old Testament, blessed in the New Testament, because basically on this chart, after the kingdom of Solomon was split into two kingdoms, before God gave the children of Israel the promised land, he told them, if you listen and obey me and serve me and other false gods, I will bless you. But if you don't serve me, I'm going to curse you and pretty much uproot you out the land. Now, in the northern tribes, these are all the kings and how long they conquered and the order that they was kings. And the red font represents a evil king. A king, instead of representing serving Jehovah, they served false gods and broke God's laws and his commandments. And then the green means that they was a good king. They obeyed Christ or Jehovah in the Old Testament. They obeyed God, kept his laws, his commandments. The black means I honestly just forgot whether they was good or bad, and I really didn't feel like reading over all the information to update this chart. Now, another thing I want to point out, so you can have an idea of like when the book of Samuel, the original book of Samuel was wrote. I have this bar here because this was the time Samuel would have been prophesying to Saul. So again, we're just scrolling down. These are the northern tribes of Israel after the kingdom split. These are the southern tribes. And again, these represents when Elijah would have been doing his ministry. This represents Elijah when he would have been prophesying and doing God's work. So again, I'm just scrolling down here. Basically, this is just a simple chart. You can always pause it, go over this information if I'm going too fast. But one of the things I want to point out here also, if you notice, with the northern tribes, they almost had all their kings was evil. Evil king after evil king after evil king, pretty much celebrating what we call today Christmas, false gods, and the winter solstice. Now, when you get down to 1722, basically, and then 1722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel, they fall to Assyrians' rule, and they pretty much cease to exist as a nation and as a kingdom. A matter of fact, they are replaced with other people all over this, from other people over the Assyrian kingdom. And you can read more about this in 2 Kings chapter 17. And again, I have these here just so you have an idea when these prophets was actually prophesying and what kings they was prophesying or what era they was prophesying in. Another thing you can look at is kind of the difference between the minor prophets and the major prophets is if it's just a short bar here, they didn't prophesy that long, they normally refer to as a minor prophet versus somebody like Isaiah who prophesied for years. He's known as a major prophet. None is more important than the next. That's just how they are described and categorized in the Bible. Now, even after the northern kingdom ceased to exist because they did not obey God, the kingdom of Yehuda still existed. And it still existed until around 786 when the last king, Zedekiah, was taken into captivity in Babylon. Now, when King Zedekiah was taken into captivity into Babylon, as you can see here, the temple is destroyed. When the temple is destroyed, these older books are destroyed also. These books would have been a much larger, way bigger collection of what we have today. They would have been huge, and a lot of them would have still been written in stone and clay. Now, this is also around the time that 2 Kings end and 2 Chronicles end, because the kingdom is fallen and they are actually taken into captivity. Now, these unknown authors, they are, even in Babylon, they're still considered like priests, and their writings are preserved versus these writings. These are destroyed. These are not lost books. They're just simply destroyed when the temple is destroyed. And the reason God has these unknown authors write basically from the book of Genesis to 2 Chronicles, it is to reserve the history of the children of Israel after they come out of a 70-year exile. Now I basically just have here some brief notes about the exile. It says Yehuda fell to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in 539 BC. Babylon fell to Medes and Persia in 538 BC. King Cyrus of Persia used a proclamation allowing the Yehudis to return to and rebuild the temple, and this happened approximately around 516 BC. So this is a 70-year exile. And after the exile, when the children of Israel, they start coming back in groups. They don't all come back at one. They come back in groups over a period of time. And instead of being like the kings of Israel or Jerusalem now, they are given titles like governors, and they have to obey still the laws of the King Cyrus, or basically the Medes and Persia. So with that being said, basically this is where we get our Old Testament from. There's 39 books of the modern day Bible. Comes from basically the time Israel became a kingdom with Saul till 430 BC. This is when the Old Testament was written, and a lot of the information in these books just come from older texts that we just don't have access to. So now, while we're still on the Old Testament, I have this next chart here. It's called the comparison of the Old Testament canon. And basically what I'm going to go over, because if you ever look, and I'm going to zoom out here really quick and I'll zoom back in. If you ever pay attention, some Bibles have more books in their Old Testament than others. And this basically gives you an example of that. The main ones that I'm talking about, we have the Hebrew Bible, which have the 39 books that we know of today in that King James Version 1769 edition. But when you look at the Roman Catholics and the Greek Orthodox Church, they have more books. And basically what I did here, the additional books that they have, I just highlighted them in a red box so you can they just stand out to you. Now the underlined stuff mean they added to those books. But then when you get back to the Protestants who translated the Geneva Bible, they take all of these added books out. Now the reason they take these added books out is because they're Protestants. Protestants literally come from the word protest. They was protesting against the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church because they knew they was teaching false doctrine and adding to the Word of God. That is why none of these books are in the Hebrew Bible, and that is why they're not in the Protestant Bible. Neither are they in the Bibles that exist today. Most people try to refer to these as the lost books. These are not the lost books. There are no lost books. They are only destroyed books. And if the Hebrews didn't have access to these books, the Romans and the Greeks most definitely would not have had access to these books. Now, from here, we're going over this term, and this is a term you need to know if you're studying the Bible and you take your studying seriously. This word canon. This word canon actually comes from Greek origin. And in Greek, the word canon refers to a ruler, what we would call today a ruler, but I have a picture here so you can have an idea of what it looked like. It was a heavy object tied to the end of the string, and they lowered the string to measure basically the distance of something. But this is what a Greek canon is. Now we use this word canon to demonstrate how we measure what books are supposed to be in the Bible and what books are not supposed to be in the Bible. And again, the word Bible is just also Latin for books. Bible only means books. So now we're going to look up the English word canon, because it kind of means the same thing. It refers to this Greek canon tool because it measures something. So it says a general law, rule, principle, or criterion by which something is judged. And again, that's referring to judging what books belong in the Bible and judging what books don't belong in the Bible. And one says a church decree or law, a collection or list of sacred books accepted as genuine. So again, these books that's in red, they're actually called the Apocrypha, and these books are just not accepted by scholars as genuine. Now, I'm not going to go over these books in great detail. I'll just give you a small example here of why these books are not accepted as genuine or accepted in the canon. We're going to read a couple of scriptures here. If you go to Hebrews 9 and 27, it says, "And as it is appointed unto man once to die, but after this is the judgment." And then Revelations 14:13 says, "And I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, Right, blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth, yea, saith the Spirit, that they must rest from their labors, and their works do follow them." Now, the reason I have these two scriptures is because they teach once you die, your faith is sealed. If you die in sin, your faith is sealed. If you die righteous, your faith is sealed. You're going to be resurrected righteous. So once you die, your faith is sealed. But now if you go to 2 Maccabees, chapter 12, verse 41, this is again the Apocrypha. This is not accepted as genuine or in the canon. And it says, "Wherefore he made the preparation for them that had died, that they might be released from their sins." Now this is completely contradict Hebrews 9:27, Revelations 14:13, and many other verses in the Bible. So, and this is what they use, and this is how they judge what books belong in the Bible and not. This is how they come up with the canon, because if it contradicts the original Hebrew Bible, or even now the New Testament, it is not considered in the canon. It's considered not genuine. It don't fit the general law, rules, or principles of the scriptures that are inspired by God. Now, another thing I want to talk about really quick is Josephus. This is a good person to know if you're studying the Bible. Josephus' work is not inspired by God, but Josephus was an Israelite who was a historian who have a lot of writing. A lot of stuff. I studied a lot of Josephus' writing. I do not agree with everything Josephus says. I have found errors in some of his stuff, but he does add and fill in a lot of blanks of what was going on at the time after Christ was crucified. Now, Josephus made this statement. He said, "We Israelites have not 10,000 books among us, disagreeing with and contradicting one another, but only 22 books, which contains the records of all time and are justly believed to be divine." So basically what Josephus was saying was kind of like if you applied that to Americans today and all of their history books. You have a ton of history books, science books, these philosophies, that philosophies. He's saying the Israelites did not have all these books, 10 million books. All they had was 22 books, which contains all the information they needed, and they did not contradict themselves. Now, most people, if you're following along, might be a little confused. You might be going, why Josephus is saying there's 22 books, but we have 39 books in our Old Testament? Well, when you continue to read Josephus' writing, he categorizes these books. He says 5 of them are books of the law, 13 cover the time of Moshe to King Xerxes, and then he says, and 4 contains hymns and precepts for the conduct of human life. So that's 22 books. But now, the reason it seems like it's less books than the Bible we have today is because the Israelites back then categorized their Bible different. So first I'm going to scroll back up. This is how we categorize the books in the Bible. They're not even in chronological order by dates or years they was wrote. They're basically categorized by historical, prophets, and wisdom, major prophets, minor prophets. We just categorize the books differently instead of putting them in chronological order. Now, the Israelites from Christ's days categorized their Old Testament different. So this is still basically the Old Testament we have today, but they combined Judges and Ruth. First and Second Samuel was one book. First and Second Kings was one book. First and Second Chronicles was one book. Ezra and Nehemiah was one book. Jeremiah and Lamentations was one book. And all of the minor prophets was one book. If you ever look up the minor prophets, you'll notice all of these are really short books. Some of them 1 chapter, 2 chapter, 3 chapter, 4 chapters. They're so short, so they categorize the minor prophets into one book. When you look at these categorized like in this way with these red boxes around them, you have 22 books. We just basically categorize ours different. We separated these books. We separated Samuel, we separated Kings, Chronicles, just in different books for the sake of studying and understanding. That's it. So where are we now? Now, basically, I just have here, because I just mentioned that the Bible is not in chronological order. They're categorized. If we was to put the Bible in chronological order, it will look more like this. We have the poetry and wisdom books first. We have minor prophet, then the major prophet Isaiah, then Hosea, and so on and so on. And again, I know this because I'm able to refer back to my chart and I can see exactly when these prophets prophesied. So it's not in chronological order, it's categorized. And then we will have the book of Genesis to Second Chronicles, which was written sometime right around it ended when the children of Israel, when the kingdom of Yehuda was taken into Babylon and exile for 70 years. And then another thing I just point out, if you notice, I have Daniel here and Daniel here because some of Daniel's writings were started before these unknown authors start studying, and some of his writings was done after. I hope you understand exactly what I'm saying. And then the Old Testament will probably end with these books here. These probably some of the latest writings in the Old Testament. So now we're here, just as the diagram go over. We have the law, which is given unto Moses, which was really wrote somewhere between 1446 and 1406 BC. We do not have access to these books. They was destroyed when the temple was destroyed. And the only reason we know what was in the original book of Moshe is because an unknown author rewrote it and preserved it for the children of Israel. Now, another thing, I'll try to mention it later. Nope, I'll mention it now just in case I forget. Now, if you notice, in the Old Testament, we have two people, one who does basically First Kings and another one who does Second Kings. The reason you have two people going over the same information because in those days, they had the law in Israel was the testimony of two men is true. So that is why you have two people combing through these books that was destroyed, preserving the history because the testimony of two men is true. And then when you get to the New Testament, you kind of have that same philosophy. Matthew, Mark, Luke, they all talking about the same thing because they all giving witness accounts of what they saw because the testimony to two men is true instead of just depending on one person. So again, so we have the law, which was written from 1446 to 1406 BC. Then we have the prophets, which began 1050 through 430 BC, and that includes the 12 minor prophets, that include the 5 major prophets, and this includes the poetry and wisdom books. A lot of people don't know King David, King Solomon, they were still prophets, and a lot of their writings they're still prophesying. Now, after the law and after the prophets, we have Christ is born in 1 AD to 33 AD. And we don't really have no writings during this time, but what's basically happened, the law that was given to the children of Israel pointed to Christ. The prophets prophesied about Christ. This is why when Christ came, he said, I come not to destroy the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them. So now we have Christ on the scene, and he's fulfilling the prophets. Now, go back to that word canon. Another reason we know that those apocryphy books does not belong in the Old Testament is because Christ never mentioned those books at all. Almost everything that Christ teach from, and even the disciples, still come from Old Testament writings. None of them come from those apocryphy books. And then even if you go to Luke chapter 24, verse 44, this is Christ's words. He says, and he said unto them, these are the words which I spake unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled, which are written in the law of Moses, that's the law, and in the prophets. Those are the prophets that prophesied from 1050 BC to 430 BC, and the Psalms. And then, of course, the Psalms is referring to the poetry and wisdom section of the Bible, which includes Job to Song of Songs. Now, after Christ is born and after Christ is crucified, we have the gospel that is written in Greek between 60 and 95 AD. And this is where we get Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and John from. Now, basically one of the things that I have here is, actually I'm going to start over, apologize. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they are not writing their books while Christ is teaching them. While Christ was here, they were students and they was taking notes. Everything that was happening with Christ, they was keeping a detailed record of it. They had bags, or you want to call them purses, and they had books, notepad, scribes. They was taking notes. Now, they just did not write an official book until 60 AD. And they basically, how they wrote their books is they reserved their notes. So they was referring back to their notes when they was writing these books. They was not writing this stuff from the top of their heads. Now, the reason I have Luke and Acts here together, a lot of people in the book is Matthew, Mark, John, and Acts. But the reason I have Luke and Acts together is because the same author wrote, which is Luke, which is a physician and a Gentile or white, wrote the book of Acts. Luke is actually one of the only white people to write a book in the Bible. Everybody else was black people. Now we get to the book of Acts. The book of Acts actually is the book that introduced Saul, or the Apostle Paul. And after Saul, or the Apostle Paul, is introduced by the book of Acts, you have 13 letters or epistles that come from Paul, which is, again, Romans to Philemon, and it's basically letters that the Apostle Paul is writing to churches in what we would pretty much call today Europe. He was called to preach the gospel in Europe. He was the one who started the church in Rome, which is called the Catholic Church today, but it is a false church. I'm not saying the Catholic Church is abiding in doctrine, because they are not. I'm just saying the original person who started the church was the Apostle Paul. So now, just again scrolling down. So this is how we pretty much end up with the Old Testament, 39 books, and the New Testament, the 27 books. Now the Old Testament are laws and prophecies that was written in Hebrew. The New Testament are new laws and new prophecies written in Greek. The old laws and the old prophecies from the Old Testament was all fulfilled by Christ. The new laws and the new prophecies, a lot of this stuff is also going to be fulfilled by Christ, but it doesn't happen until the book of Revelations. And many these laws and prophecies referring to Christ's first coming, these laws and prophecies refer to his second coming. And now this pretty much gets us into how we get the Bible that we have today in America. William Tyndale actually took this New Testament Bibles that was written in Greek, and in 1534 he translated the Greek Bible into English. William Tyndale was a priest and a scribe. One of the things I want to point out in William's Tyndale version of the Bible, his translation in 1534, if you notice, and this is just Matthew chapter 1 verses 1 through 11, there is no J in the Matthew Tyndale, in the William Tyndale version of the Bible. I have a tendency of saying Matthew because Matthew here, I don't know, William sounded like, so I apologize about that. But in the Williams Tyndale version, there's not one J in the entire New Testament. And that is why, if you notice in this lesson, I just scroll back up, a lot of these words that typically start with a J in the Old Testament, I remove them and I put the correct transliteration, because the J is a false translation. It don't belong in the Bible. But we're going to go over that in the next lesson. Now, after the William Tyndale's version of the Bible, there was a few other Bibles translated. I'm going to talk about those in the next lesson. But eventually, we get to the King James Version Bible, the Oxford version of 1769. And again, this is the major Bible that influenced all the other translations today. But in this translation, instead of Christ's name being Jesus, his name is Jesus. And now all of a sudden we have the letter J in the New Testament in 1769, but in the 1534 translation of the William Tyndale, there's no J in the Bible, and we're going to really focus on this in the next lesson, and where the J came from and where the name Jesus come from, before we get into teaching actually Old Testament and New Testament doctrine. So let's see here. In kind of closing, it says, how did Christ's name change in English from Jesus to Jesus? And that is what we're going to focus on in the next lesson. But again, this answers the question of the Bible. What is it? Where did it come from? The Bible is not a religious book. It is actually a history book, and it is the history of the children of Israel. It is not a religious book. It is a history book. And today, this King James Version Bible, almost all translations today is a version of the King James Bible of 1769. This is where Christ's name first appears as Jesus. But before 1769, William Tyndale, which is called the father of like the New Testament because he's the first one to translate it, Christ's name is not Jesus, it is Jesus. And again, like I said in the next lesson, we're going to focus on why did Christ's name, or how did it change from Jesus to Jesus. So with that being said, this concludes this gospel.